Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. Israel, cursed by Allah, is now being hit by a great punishment. This sinful land feels the wrath of God. When the punishment descends, a strong wind rages, sweeping away everything and causing a great fire. In the midst of the chaos of the disaster, something surprising happens. Thousands of soldiers who previously stood in the enemy ranks now turn away and choose Islam. The video that was spread shows the unexpected moment, the troops who submitted to his guidance. At the same time, a large forest fire hit Israel, burning thousands of hectares of land. The fire grew rapidly, accompanied by strong winds that made the flames difficult to control. Zionist residents ran in panic, as if they were facing the end of the world. The fire started in the Mosque area, which used to be a Palestinian village. In a short time, the fire spread to various places due to the hot wind. The Israeli Fire Department reported that around 2,500 hectares of land were burned. Several vehicles were also victims. Efforts to extinguish the fire were carried out on a large scale, but were hampered by the difficult terrain and increasingly bad air conditions. Thick smoke forced many officers to take a break, and some were even injured from breathing toxic air. The situation worsened when the main highway, number 38, was closed for evacuation. Thousands of residents were forced to evacuate under emergency conditions, with the villages of Estol and Meselet Zion being the priority for evacuation. Residents of Asalbatitman and Mesilosian were also directed to leave their homes. In the midst of the chaos, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu held an emergency meeting and ordered that evacuation routes be kept open. He knew very well that if the fire reached Jerusalem, the impact would be much greater. But in reality, controlling the fire was not easy. Extreme heat made matters worse. The Israel Meteorological Agency predicted that temperatures would continue to rise to nearly 30 degrees in the next few days, causing the fire to grow out of control. Strong winds every afternoon accelerated the spread of the fire to new areas. In a desperate situation, Netanyahu contacted the United States and other countries for help, but the response was not as expected. In the midst of the disaster, people began to think that this was punishment for the injustices committed by Israel against Palestine. Many Israelis began to talk about karma. They began to realize that their country was suffering the consequences of brutal actions against the Palestinian people, such as the brutal attacks on the Gaza Strip that caused many casualties, including children. The international community strongly condemned the action, but Israel remained unmoved. The situation in the refugee camps was dire. Residents could only bring the clothes on their bodies, while children cried in fear, and parents were busy looking for shelter. In that fear, thousands of Israeli soldiers began to reflect on this incident. Many of them felt that all of this was not a coincidence, mixed with guilt and fear. Some began to cry silently, pray for forgiveness, and some decided to seek the truth that they had ignored so far. In this situation, thousands of Israeli soldiers finally decided to pronounce the Shahada and convert to Islam. They felt that this disaster was a strong rebuke from God and wanted to repent and improve their lives through the teachings of Islam. This news is a glimmer of hope for the Palestinian people, who welcome these new brothers with open arms. They realize that guidance belongs to Allah, and whoever receives it is their brother in faith. Meanwhile, Netanyahu and other Zionist leaders are increasingly cornered. They not only have to deal with a major natural disaster, but also a crisis of confidence in their own country. Israel now faces two major choices: continue to persist in arrogance or admit their mistakes and repent. However, given the history of the country, the first option seems more likely. Unfortunately, that choice will only lead them to greater destruction. Amid the ever-spreading fires, the atmosphere in Israel is increasingly chaotic. The international media is beginning to report on the magnitude of the fires that have hit. Many countries that previously supported Israel are now choosing to remain silent, and there is no massive aid like before. Israel is now left to fight alone. The fires have not only destroyed forests and settlements, but have also revealed many facts that have been hidden, including about the lands that were burned, much of which was Palestinian land that was previously seized by force. Zionist citizens who have lost their homes are beginning to feel the suffering that the Palestinian people have been experiencing. They felt what it was like to be expelled, homeless, and living in fear. In the midst of confusion and suffering, thousands of Israeli soldiers became more determined to recite the Shahada and convert to Islam. They no longer felt ashamed or afraid. Some of them, who used to be part of the elite troops, now teach the Shahada to fellow soldiers. They felt that the heavy burden that had been holding their hearts was finally lifted. One of them was David, a former troop commander who was once notorious for being cruel to the Palestinian people. Now he stands in public and announces his conversion to Islam. He admitted that his heart melted when he saw Palestinian children still smiling, even though their homes were destroyed. David's decision inspired many other soldiers to follow in his footsteps. Within days, thousands of soldiers openly declared themselves to be Muslims. This certainly made the Israeli government panic, worried that this phenomenon would weaken their military strength. The government tried to divert public attention by spreading the issue that the fires were caused by sabotage, but this accusation was not supported by strong evidence. Fire experts stated that extreme hot weather was the main cause. With the increasingly desperate conditions, Netanyahu lost support from within his own party. Many senior politicians demanded that he step down, saying that he had completely failed in dealing with this disaster. Meanwhile, hardline Zionist groups began to act anarchically. They attacked soldiers who converted to Islam and burned down small mosques built for the converts. However, the converts remained steadfast, convinced that their decision was correct. They did not fight back violently, only defended themselves fully. Their calm attitude made many citizens begin to feel sympathy. Slowly, the perception of Islam among the Israeli people began to change. Amidst the chaos, voices from outside Israel grew louder, calling for Israel to stop its arrogance. In Gaza and the West Bank, Palestinians greeted the news with prayer and hope. They prayed that their new brothers and sisters who had converted to Islam would be given steadfastness in their faith, even though they knew that the journey of these converts would not be easy. The fires continued. The flames were getting closer to West Jerusalem, and great destruction was inevitable. Israel was now facing a real test. This disaster had exposed the arrogance that they had always held on to. Their own people began to realize that military and political power could not oppose the will of God. They began to understand that justice and truth were stronger than bullets and bombs. Meanwhile, the fires that had burned almost all of Israel's forests had not yet been extinguished, worsening the increasingly uncontrollable situation. Extreme temperatures and strong winds made matters worse. In desperation, Israelis began to feel that what they once thought was justice was being turned on its head. The converts, who were once Zionist soldiers, were now becoming more and more courageous in public, expressing their beliefs without fear. They stood firm in the heat, reciting the Shahada with conviction. Some even invited their families to join Islam. These changes were increasingly coming to the surface, even though Israel tried to hide them. The world began to see the great changes taking place inside Israel, shaking the entire world. However, the situation was getting more complicated. Zionist extremist groups were acting more radically, attacking anyone they considered a traitor, including converts. Some converts' homes were burned down, and many were forced to flee with only a few belongings. Even so, more and more stood firm, undaunted by the threat. Uncontrolled natural disasters made matters worse. Displaced residents lived in makeshift tents with limited facilities. There was not enough food, clean water, or medicine, and a sense of despair began to creep into many. Israel was now on the brink of collapse, with widespread fires, a refugee crisis, and internal political turmoil threatening the sustainability of its government. The outside world was starting to pay less and less attention, as they began to realize that what was happening in Israel was the fruit of arrogance and injustice that had been committed. The truth was beginning to become clear before the eyes of the world. Amidst the destruction, a profound change is taking place in this wounded land. Israelis, once secure in their military might and international support, are now caught in an inescapable predicament. The raging fires are closing in on West Jerusalem, threatening the country's vital centers. But more terrifying is the fact that Israelis, once loyal to Zionist ideology, are beginning to question everything they believe. In the cramped refugee camps, amid the sweltering heat and thick smoke that fills the sky, thousands of newly converted soldiers gather. They are finding not only faith in their new religion, but also who they truly are, without fear, without shame. Among them, David, the former commander, is now a respected figure. With full confidence, he stands before the soldiers and the Palestinians who have taken refuge in makeshift tents. My brothers, this is a test from God. What we see today, the disaster that has befallen us all, is not an accident. It is the result of our mistakes. We have been trapped in a big lie, but today we can choose to return to the right path. Return to the all-forgiving God, to Islam that brings peace, David said in a loud voice, his eyes looking far ahead. There was a moment of silence. The soldiers who listened to David's words began to reflect. Some of them cried, feeling that their lives had been shackled by lies and violence all this time. They felt they had gained new strength that they had not had before. However, the resistance against them did not stop there. The increasingly radical Zionist extremist group began to launch attacks on converts and their sympathizers. The houses of converts were burned, and most of the soldiers who decided to convert to Islam were forced to hide, avoiding retaliation from the hardline group. However, behind these threats, their spirit remained unwavering. They felt that this journey was the right path, even though it was full of obstacles. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Netanyahu was increasingly cornered. Confidence in him is dwindling, even within his own party. Senior politicians are calling for him to step down, blaming his leadership for the escalating disaster. The international media, which used to side with Israel, is now turning its back on it. They are reporting how the fires in Israel are not just caused by extreme weather, but also by years of injustice against the Palestinians. Several countries that previously supported Israel are now choosing to withhold their support. The international community is beginning to realize that the violence and injustice committed by Israel against the Palestinians has had major consequences that cannot be avoided. In the worsening atmosphere, thousands of Palestinian refugees who are now living in makeshift tents in various places heard news about the phenomenon of soldiers converting to Islam. They greeted this news with prayers, hoping that more people would be awakened to seek truth and justice. Many of them, despite living in suffering, still believe that change will come one day. They pray for victory that is not only seen from physical strength, but from greatness of heart and faith. In the midst of confusion, Netanyahu held an emergency meeting with high-ranking state officials. However, this time, there was no solution that could be offered. The situation was getting out of control. The fires were spreading, and thousands of people who lost their homes had to live in cramped refugee tents, without enough food or clean water. Despair was gripping many Israelis, even those who had previously strongly supported the government's policies. Slowly, voices from within Israel were getting louder. Many citizens began to doubt the survival of their country. They began to open their eyes to the reality that the Israel they had known so far was the result of colonization and oppression. They began to realize that true justice could only be achieved by respecting the rights of all people, including the Palestinian people who had been wronged for so long. When the fires finally subsided, though there were still hot spots threatening to break out, Israel had changed. A country that had once seemed invincible was now on the brink of collapse. Thousands of soldiers who had converted to Islam stood firm, and they stood not only for themselves, but for a greater justice. Life in Israel was now divided. Some still supported the government, fighting in their own way, but more and more were joining the new voices calling for peace and justice. Many of those who had once been complicit in its oppression were now trying to right their wrongs, taking the Shahada and choosing a different path. In Gaza and the West Bank, throughout the Muslim world, people celebrated this victory in their hearts, even though they knew the struggle was long. They knew that the road to peace and justice was fraught with obstacles, but they were confident that God was always with them. And while Israel continues to grapple with natural disasters and political upheaval, the world is witnessing a major change, which began with the submission of thousands of Zionist soldiers to their God, the most gracious and most merciful. Although the physical fighting in Israel has subsided, the inner conflict in the hearts of its people continues to rage. The divided Israeli people are now divided between those who hold fast to the ideology of Zionism and those who seek redemption through justice and a new consciousness. In this uncertainty, the movement led by the soldiers who converted to Islam is growing stronger, forming an unexpected network of solidarity in the midst of a turbulent society. Amid the cries of the Palestinian refugees who now live in makeshift camps in neighboring countries, a group of Israelis has begun to mobilize. They are no longer just former soldiers who have converted to Islam, but also a number of young Israelis who feel they can no longer support the brutal policies against the Palestinians. This group, called New Hope, has begun organizing peaceful demonstrations in various Israeli cities. They seek to carry a message of change, calling on Israelis to acknowledge their past sins and seek a just solution for all parties. In Tel Aviv, a large demonstration was held by this group. Thousands of Israelis, both those who were previously loyal to their country and those who have only recently become aware of the injustices that have occurred, took to the streets. They carried banners that read, "Justice for all, peace for all." Despite the fierce resistance of Zionist extremists, their voices grew louder. Some international leaders began to show their support for the movement, even though they still had doubts about the possibility of achieving real peace. David, now one of the symbols of the movement, spoke to the excited crowd. His face radiated calm, though his eyes betrayed the long suffering he had endured. "We are not your enemies," David said in a voice full of conviction. "We are not enemies of the Israeli people. We only want the truth to be done, peace to be achieved, and justice to overcome the hatred that has been fostered for decades. We, who once fought each other, now stand here with you to build a better future." David's presence in front of the crowd boosted the spirit of the demonstrators. However, many of them still doubted the magnitude of the change. Their country, which had been filled with propaganda of pride, strength, and superiority, was suddenly faced with a big question: can it all be restored? In Jerusalem, in a tightly locked meeting room, Netanyahu faced enormous pressure from within and outside the country. All around him were worried faces. Some of Israel's top officials, who had once supported him, were now turning away, wanting change to save their country from further destruction. "How can we continue with this policy?" asked a senior official sitting across from him, his face full of wrinkles. "The whole world is looking at us with suspicion, and our people are increasingly divided. We cannot continue to maintain this injustice without paying a higher price." Netanyahu responded with tension in his voice. "If we give in, we will lose everything. We must defend our land, defend our identity." But other, more moderate voices were beginning to be heard within the Israeli government. They are proposing talks with the Palestinians, hoping that tensions can be eased through negotiations based more on genuine peace. But for many, this feels like a step too late. Israel, once considered invincible, is on the brink of collapse, and abroad, many are beginning to doubt their commitment to peace. Meanwhile, in Gaza, despite the ongoing suffering, there are glimmers of hope. The international solidarity movement is growing stronger. Humanitarian organizations, previously struggling to enter the Palestinian territories, are now able to provide much-needed aid. The worldwide network of Palestinian refugees is gaining support from an international community concerned about human rights and justice. But despite the growing hope, many recognize that the path to peace will not be easy. This struggle, which involves not just geography, but also hearts and minds, is long and challenging. In the midst of this, David and the other converts continue to walk the path they have chosen, even though they know that hatred and resistance are still great. But they are convinced that every small step they take toward peace is a step toward a better future for all of humanity. Finally, amidst the burning rubble, in the refugee camps filled with hope and prayer, one message is beginning to spread. Peace is not just a dream, but a goal that we must achieve together. As the fighting on the ground subsides, tensions in the hearts of people continue to grow, both in Palestine and Israel. Both sides, once trapped in a never-ending cycle of hatred, are beginning to realize that peace is not just an ideal, but a pressing need for their future. But the path to peace is fraught with obstacles. In Gaza, amid the devastating ruins, Aya Ibrahim, a senior figure in the Palestinian community, stands on ground long stained with blood and tears. He gazes out at the gray horizon, but his eyes still hold a glimmer of hope. Peace is not an easy word, he tells the young people gathered around him, but we have to start from within ourselves. If we can't change our hearts, how can we expect change to happen out there? The young people listen intently, knowing that the path to peace is arduous. Their families have lost so much in the conflict, and the pain is still raw. But Aya Ibrahim, despite his age, reminds them that the fight for peace must begin with nurturing the humanity within each of us. In Israel, despite fierce resistance to change, a group known as New Hope continues to grow. Those who were once on the front lines of war are now choosing a different path. The group is made up not only of soldiers who have converted to Islam, but also of civilians who are beginning to wake up to the reality they have chosen not to see. David, who has become increasingly recognized as a symbol of this movement, is beginning to speak more openly about his past. He is not only talking about his experiences as an Israeli soldier, but also about his long journey toward awareness and redemption. Every word that comes out of his mouth sounds like a call to collective consciousness, an invitation for the Israeli people to break the chains of hatred that have bound them for years. "I fought for this land with all the strength I had," David told a rapt crowd in Tel Aviv, "but I realized that that strength is not enough to erase the suffering that has been caused. We must change the way we see each other. We are not enemies. We are human beings who must live side by side, not destroy each other." Not everyone, however, is ready to accept this change. A hardline group still loyal to conservative Zionist ideology, led by senior figures like Yair, continues to protest and call for further violence. They consider the peace movement spearheaded by David and his group to be a betrayal of the state of Israel. "This is not the time for compromise," Yair said in a loud and angry voice. "If we start talking about peace, we will lose everything. This land is ours and we cannot give it up." Yair and his group became more aggressive in their actions. They carried out attacks on those they considered traitors, even those who supported dialogue and reconciliation. Tensions were rising, and the country was nearing the breaking point of instability. But despite the resistance, there were signs that change was possible. Even among the soldiers who had been involved in the brutal fighting, some were beginning to feel a deep sense of doubt about the cause they were fighting for. They knew they were on a mission they had never questioned before, but now they were beginning to wonder about the price that had been paid in the thousands of lives on both sides. In a discussion room full of former soldiers in a corner of the city, David spoke again. This time not to a large crowd, but in a more intimate forum, a place where those who had fought together could talk heart to heart. "Can we go on living our lives ignoring what we have done?" David asked his friends, who were now listening more than responding. "Can we live in peace if we don't admit that we've made mistakes? If we don't acknowledge the suffering of others?" There was silence. Some of them lowered their heads, feeling guilty. Others looked at David as if searching for answers. Outside, a small, almost invisible movement began to grow. Palestinians who were once trapped in hatred began to step forward to dialogue with those who were once their enemies. Young people from Gaza took the initiative to organize a meeting with young Israelis who support peace. This meeting was not just about politics or land borders, but about recognizing and understanding each other's suffering. At first, the meeting was filled with tension and fear, but slowly they began to open their hearts to each other. On a quiet night, under the sparkling stars, young Palestinians and Israelis sat together. They talked about their lives, about their dreams, and about the future they wanted. There were no words of hatred, only hope that could finally speak. When the sun set, despite the obstacles that still loomed, they knew that they had taken the first step toward real peace. This small step may not be enough to end the conflict that has been going on for so long, but at least they have begun a journey together, filled with courage, sacrifice, and hope. In the midst of a world still wounded, there is a glimmer of light that is beginning to appear, and maybe someday, that light will illuminate the path to the peace they have longed for. These small steps are not enough to change the world, but they are the seeds of hope that are beginning to grow. In Palestine, in Gaza, a new initiative is beginning. Father Ibrahim, who has long been known as a wise man, is beginning to realize that dialogue that begins with the heart is the key to building more humane relationships. There is nothing more powerful than the voice of a sincere human heart, he said in a meeting with young leaders. We must remind ourselves that we are all born with the same right to live in peace. And if we want to change this world, we must start from our own hearts. Amid the ruins that still lie in Gaza, many are beginning to feel that they are fighting not just for their land, but for their humanity. A youth movement called Gaza Reborn is growing rapidly. They are a group of young people who are tired of war and are now trying to rebuild their society through education and a culture of peace. They hold seminars, discussions, and self-development programs, trying to change the mindset that has been colored by hatred and violence. Meanwhile, in Israel, the New Hope movement is gaining support from various groups. While many remain opposed, others are beginning to open up to the once utopian ideas of peace. They are building better bridges of communication with the Palestinian people, seeking to find common ground in their feelings of loss, hope, and desire to see future generations live in peace. David, now increasingly recognized as a moral leader among the New Hope movement, is often held up as a symbol of resistance to hatred. On one occasion, David spoke before an international forum that brought together figures from various countries, including Palestine and Israel. He spoke about his personal journey, about how he witnessed injustice, but also how he found the strength to forgive and move toward peace. I am not a perfect person, David told the forum participants. I too have been part of this conflict, doing things I now regret. But I have learned one very important thing, that we cannot change the past, but we can change the way we see the future. Peace is not just about not fighting, it is about living together in mutual respect and understanding. David did not only talk about peace in theory, but also gave real examples of how dialogue and understanding can change a person's life. He invited several Palestinian figures to speak, and there, for the first time, Palestinians and Israelis spoke to each other in front of the world, sharing their stories of suffering but also of hope. However, the struggle is not easy. Those who are still trapped in hatred continue to try to thwart this peace effort. Yair and his group still consider this peace movement a threat to the existence of Israel. They continue to incite violence, provoke riots, and try to thwart dialogue between the two nations. On the other hand, in Gaza, young people from the Gaza Reborn group face the same threats. Those who try to pioneer a new path towards peace are often the target of intimidation, even death threats. However, despite their fear, they do not back down. In the midst of this difficulty, an unexpected incident occurred. In a small village on the Israeli-Palestinian border, a huge explosion occurred, destroying several houses and killing a number of people from both sides. This incident shocked the whole world, and many felt that peace was now on the brink. However, in the midst of this tragedy, a new movement emerged. Young Palestinians and Israelis who had been involved in the peace movement, despite being wounded and heartbroken, did not give up. They organized the largest peace rally the region had ever seen, a rally that drew thousands of people from both sides. They carried banners that read, "Peace begins with us," and in the crowd, they held candles in memory of the victims of this endless violence. As night fell, the candles lit together, a symbol of hope that would never be extinguished. Despite the divisions, despite the hatred and fear, they knew that this long journey had only just begun. Their decision to stand together against despair and hatred was the first step that would shape their future. The statements made by David, Aya Ibrahim, and the young leaders were part of a powerful momentum that eventually caught the attention of the world. The outside world began to give greater support to the peace process, facilitating negotiations and putting pressure on both sides to resolve their problems through diplomacy rather than violence. Yet their journey toward peace remained challenging. Both sides still bore deep wounds, and the cycle of hatred was still very strong. But step by step, each small act reminds them that even though the road to peace is steep and full of obstacles, each act of kindness and courage brings them closer to their desired goal. And perhaps one day, when the children of Gaza and the children of Israel look up at the sky, they will not only see birds flying free, they will also see the hope that grows from hearts that have been reconciled. The massive rally sent a wave of global awareness. News of thousands of people standing together, hands clasped in candles, spread around the world, inspiring similar movements in countries ravaged by conflict. From Sudan to Afghanistan, from the United States to Europe, people began to stand up to convey a simple but powerful message. That peace is not a lofty dream, but a choice that anyone can make. But despite the outpouring of international support, internal resistance persisted. Leaders who held on to hatred and division continued to stir up trouble. In Gaza, some radical groups saw the peace gestures as a sign of weakness. In Israel, extremists who saw a threat to peace felt that every concession was a sign of defeat. But even as they tried to extinguish the flames of hope that had begun to burn, the fire grew larger and larger. David, Father Ibrahim, and others did not remain silent. They recognized that even though peace was not easy to secure, they had to keep fighting for it, even if it meant facing betrayal, threats, and unrelenting hatred. Each time they face a new obstacle, they remind themselves that this struggle is not just for them, but for future generations. In Gaza, Aya Ibrahim continues his work with the group Gaza Reborn, teaching children and young people about the importance of building a better future. In each lesson, he plants a seed of wisdom. We are all guardians of the future. If we want to see a different world, we must be agents of that change. In Israel, David continues to advocate for understanding and tolerance, traveling to schools and communities, speaking to young people about how they can be part of positive change. He often says, education is not just about teaching facts, but about teaching how to live together in peace. Despite the violence that still rages, they are beginning to see that change is possible. Over time, more people from both sides join them in this struggle. One by one, more hearts are opening, and more people are beginning to see that hatred only brings more suffering, while peace brings hope and opportunity for a better future. Finally, after years of struggle, the world has seen a major breakthrough. Under growing pressure from the international community and the overwhelming will of the Israeli and Palestinian people to end the conflict, the two sides have sat down at the negotiating table. A dialogue that began with small steps, with candles lit in the dark, has led to a historic peace agreement. Of course, the peace was not perfect right away. There are tensions that remain. There are hatreds that have not been completely eradicated. But for the first time in the long history of this conflict, there is real hope that the future can be different. The children of Gaza and Israel, who have grown up in the shadow of war, now have the opportunity to live more peaceful lives. They no longer have to inherit the hatred of their parents. They can choose to live differently. As David and Aya Ibrahim stood in front of a newly built school on the Israeli-Palestinian border, they looked at each other. There, in the midst of a land once devastated by war, were the smiles of children playing together without fear. "This is the first step of a long journey," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "But it is the right step, and we will keep going." Ibrahim's father nodded, his eyes shining. "The future we dreamed of is already coming true. It may not be perfect, but every smile on these children's faces is proof that we never gave up." The two of them stood there, gazing at the horizon that was slowly lighting up with new light. A light that came not just from the rising sun, but from the hearts of people who chose to make peace, chose to love, chose to live together in peace. And though the journey was long, they knew one thing for sure. This struggle was not about who would win or lose, but about who could build a better world for their children. Because in the end, peace is not just about the end of war, but about how we choose to live together in love and understanding.